Hi, this is Brian with Prophetless Medium Post. Welcome to part 2 of the Erase Anything tutorial. In part 1, we erased our person from the shot and had them reappear about 40 frames later. In this tutorial, we're going to add some simple energy and particle effects to make the shot a little bit more interesting. The possibilities here are limitless. The hope of this tutorial is to serve as a good base level for understanding the workflow and creating your own effects. So here's my last render. So what we're going to do is add this energy-like effect and use it for our transitions often on the screen. We will also add some shadows from the energy effect to help it blend into the scene a little nicer. Lastly, we'll look at using the simple particle system to have our basketball player burst into particles when he goes off screen, and then set up just the reverse when he comes back on. So we have the energy effect swirling. We have the shadows coming on over here to the side. And then as the energy effect goes away, we can see him bursting in particles. And then at the end, you can see the particles coming together to form back into him with the energy effect. So let's start with creating our own energy effect. If you'd like to create an effect similar to what we saw in the CM de la VEGA video, I would highly recommend you check out the video from Essential Video Editing on Shockwave Animation. He shows you how to make an energy effect in Fusion similar to what you would find on a stock video site and set it up as a macro that you can reuse and make adjustments. I'll put a link to that down below. Okay, so what we're going to do is make some shapes and then use some noise and displacement nodes to create something like a swirling vertex energy effect. So this is where we left off in part 1. And if we come over here, I have a couple of shapes that I've already done. So we can see the first one here, just a simple 4-pointed star. And then I have an ellipse, and that's just to help add a little bit more complexity to it. So let's just quickly take a look at the settings that I have for each. So in the polygon, you can see I built this shape and I softened the edge a little bit, and that's to help with when we start doing the displacement, that'll make some wispiness, and I'll show you that in a minute. We have it set to solid. In the ellipse, we also softened the edge and brought up the border width because we turned it off from solid. It was solid, turn that off, bring the border width up and some soft edge. Let's start with the first one here. So we're going to need a few nodes to do this. So I'm going to grab a background node, a noise, and a displace node. And these are the nodes that we're going to use to start making our effect. So first we have our polygon. I'm going to use this as a mask into our background. And in the background, we're going to change some of the colors. So I'm going to change this around. Let's change the background to gradient and the gradient type to radial. And then I can use these little points here. You can see what we got here. This is the center of the radial gradient, and then we can use this one to bring it brighter or darker, whatever you want. And I'm just going to change some of these colors. So I want the center to actually be white, and then I'm going to use like a blue. So I actually want these flipped. So I'm just going to flip those over. The black color, let's change that to a blue. So I'm going to do something like this. Next, let's take a look at the noise. So we have this noise here. We want to change the settings quite a bit. We want to bring up the detail, some contrast, maybe a little bit of brightness, and definitely the scale. And then what we can do is turn on discontinuous and inverted. And now you see we have this kind of pattern, and this kind of pattern is going to be really nice in doing the displacement. Okay, so to save time with all of these settings, and instead of you watching me go through and dial in everything, I have some numbers that I've already worked out. So I'm just going to start plugging those in. So you can see I put in the seed rate here too. So you can see this is the energy effect that will be running the displacement. To start working with the displacement, we want to take our background and drop it into the yellow input. And then we'll take our noise and drop it into the green input of the displace. And now let's take a look at the displace. So in the displace right away, if you want to start, you don't really see too much happening. You just start using the refraction strength. And as we start to bring this up, you can see that is breaking everything up. If we press play, you can see now we're getting kind of this energy style effect. Now with all of these settings, you can just play with them. I would definitely take some time and play around with these settings because you can get all kinds of cool effects. Again, this is just a baseline for you to be able to create your own. So again, I'm going to start adding in the settings that I have already worked out. So that's the first one. So to make this a little bit more interesting, we're going to add another shape, and of course, add more shapes. Do, play around. This is the creative part. So I'm just going to grab these 3 nodes. I'm going to copy them and paste them. And let's take a look at the ellipse. Okay, inside the background. I'm going to kind of flip this around, and we want to keep it gradient, radial, and something like that. You can always come back and mess around with these settings later. So, okay, that looks good. And the fast noise and the displace, I'm just going to change the settings in each one of those. Okay, and then the displace. Okay, and let's see what we got. So now we have that. So slightly different. And then now we can merge these together. So let's take this and we'll merge it together. And so now we have this kind of shape. Okay, and that's looking okay. Again, play around with this stuff. There's a lot you can do. Okay, so now what I would like to do is I want to change the shape of this. I want to have some kind of like blurry wispiness, because the animation that we're going to do is we're going to have this kind of vortexy, it's swirling and it zooms in and out. So I'm going to use a directional blur. And in that directional blur, set the length to, and we want to change that from linear to radial. So something like that. So I like this part, but I don't really like the center. So one thing I could do is add a mask. So I'm going to add an ellipse mask and drop that into the mask of the directional blur. And right now it's everything inside of it is going to be blurred, but I want it just the opposite. So I'm going to invert it, and then I'm going to bring this down. And then I'm going to soften the edges. So something like that I think looks kind of cool, just so it's not all just blur. Let's see how that's looking. Okay, it's kind of okay. I mean, this is going to happen pretty fast, so no big deal. One other thing I'd like to do is these streaks are just kind of looking kind of weird. I'm not crazy about that. I'd like to break this up some. So another thing we could do is, if we look at this, we can use this to push another displace on this. So let's try that. Going to add this display. So we're going to bring this into the input and then this one into the foreground. And then let's look at the displace, and let's just bring that up something like that. So just a little bit. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. And that's breaking up some of that swirl. I'm just going to organize this a little bit. So now we're ready to start working on the animation. So at this point, you could get into each one of these polygons and you can animate them separately, but I kind of want to control it all in one spot. So I'm going to use a transform node to do our rotation, the scaling in and out, and to track along with the basketball player as he moves through. Let's add a transform node. I'm going to grab transform node, and then we're going to go into that. And let's bring this into the comp. So I'm going to grab and merge, drop this in, and we're going to drop this on top. And let's take a look at what we got. Before I start animating the effect going on and off, the first thing I want to do is actually get this center to track along with the player, because we want this effect to kind of go with him as he's running towards the basket. So one way we could do that is we can go back up to our original clip, and so that we can see it, and then we're going to select the transform, and then we can just move this handle around. We don't have to do the whole thing, but we know for a fact that our transition point is 31 and 71 are the two transition points. So I'm going to go back at least 5, 6, maybe, because the effect is we'll make the effect probably like 5 frames on either side of the transition. So maybe we'll start at frame 24. And in that transform, we're just going to bring this to somewhere around the center of his back. Once we do that, let's go over to the transform center and hit keyframe. And then we're just going to do this loose. We're just going to go 30. So every 5 frames or so, we might have to go back and check. Yeah, see, it's like pretty good. Go another 5 frames. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just want it to be kind of close to right square in the bottom of his back. And at this point, the effect will be off. So now we can go all the way up to probably around here. We have 71, we know. So we can go to 71. We can put a keyframe here. And then let's go back to 65. And then go to 75, 80. By then it should be off. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We got a decent track of our basketball player. Now let's start setting up the off and on. So we know, let's start with 31. We know we want the effect to be at its fullest here at the transition point. So we're going to scale this down. And let's scale it down, and it should, okay, before I do this, I actually want to, right now we have this keyframe and it just shuts off. I want to like blend it a little bit, so I'm going to give a little bit of room. So instead of it just like the shadow just disappearing, it's going to fade off, and we can do that inside the Mac control. That's where we did this blend setting. And I just want to move the keyframe a little bit so that I have a little bit more room. I'm just going to move it like 1 keyframe. So we can do that by going into the keyframe. And if we look at the blend, we open up the Mac control and blend. Let's just take this and move 1 keyframe. And we'll do the same thing over here. Just 1 extra keyframe. That way you can see on frame 31, he starts to go off. And then he's gone. Okay, so anyway, let's get back to where we were. We're 31, frame 31, and I want this, the effect to pretty much cover him. So that looks pretty good right there, we'll say. And then we can set a keyframe on the size. And then we want to go 5 frames back and 5 frames forward for the effect. So I'm going to go to frame 26, and we're going to bring down the size. Now, I've been having a little bug lately with Fusion where if I go to 0, the frame might go black. And if that were to be the case, I'm just going to go to 0.2, and then I'm going to use this merge to fade on these effects. So from 31, we want to go to 36. And see, I went to 0 here, and this whole screen went black. So instead of dealing with trying to figure out why that's a problem, I'm just going to set our size to 0.02, which is pretty small. And then I'm going to use the merge later to fade that off. That's the first one. So now we have this effect. We have it growing. We'll get to the spin in a minute. So that one's done. Now we got to do the 71. So on frame 71, we want the size about like that. Go back 5 frames, and we're going to put that to 2, and then ahead 5 frames to 76. Okay. Okay, so now we got the size. Okay, that looks great. And before we forget, I just want to make sure that I get that the merge blend done. So let's take care of that right now. So we have, 5 on either side. So on frame 26 is when we have this at 0.02. I'm going to go in the merge. Let's click on keyframe, and I'm going to go 1 frame and turn it off. So now we have the little dot coming on and then growing. And so I'm going to do the same thing. So it's 36. We'll put a keyframe at 1. Go to 37, turn it off. Okay, and then we got to do the same thing up here. So we had 66 is 5 frames back, so that should be at 1. 65, we'll turn it off. Then 76, we want it at 1. Click a keyframe. 76. Okay, so now let's take care of the rotation. So we let's go to our transform. We'll start at 26. We want this to be set, the angle is set at 0, and then it goes off at Actually, let's just give it an extra frame. So after it goes off, and we want it to turn clockwise. So let me do that. Let's see how fast that is. Okay, that might be okay. All right, so negative 328. So I'm going to go to the very end of this effect, which was like 76. I'm going to put a keyframe here so that it's the same animation, and we'll go back to 66 and set that to 0. Now that we have our energy effect done, now we can add in some shadows that are cast from the energy effect. And one way we could do that is if we look at this transform, we actually have an alpha here. And we can use that alpha to drive the shadow. So how can we do that? Let's add in a background, and we're going to drop this into the mask portion of it. And then we can just bring that on top of our composition. So I'm going to put that in the foreground, and if we take a look through here, now you can see we have this black shadow. Now we just need to move this into place. Okay, and what we can do is this transform already has the animation of the particle effect. So all we really need to do is position this on the ground so that it matches, and it should work out pretty well. So let's add in a corner positioner to sort of position this in a different way. So I'm going to add in the, whoop, not there. So let's change the mapping type to bilinear. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's see how that works. Now that should be in the right position. And we can check it by using the A-B. Use a split screen, and we can take in the B side. Go back up to our original clip, throw the B side in, our main clip into the B side, and then we can kind of look to see how it lines up with the actual shadow. Oops, I just noticed something right there. We just merged in the shadow. And remember, we used in Merge 4, we used the fade in. We used some keyframes to fade in and out energy effect. Well, we need those keyframes here to turn off the shadow, or else the shadow is going to just keep on going throughout the entire shot. So one quick way we could do that is we can just basically, we can connect or just copy the blend mode right into Merge 5. So Merge 4 is where we have our keyframes. In Merge 5, if we go over to the blend, just to right click, connect to Merge 4, blend. And that's going to copy all those keyframes, and now that little dot is gone. Okay, so let's get back to checking our shadow again. Okay, so that looks like it's a little off now. That is over here. Yeah, see, that doesn't look good. Okay, so we might have to do a couple keyframes on this corner positioner. I'm going to bring this back to, well, I mean, it was pretty good up to here. So let's keyframe these. So top left, top right. We'll just keyframe each one of these. And then let's go up to 71 where we can really see it. And then let's line this up. Maybe something like that. And now that might work out. That might be all the transform we need. Let's see. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, so that's it. We just needed 2 keyframes on that, and then I think our shadows are looking pretty good. Other than the fact that they're extremely dark. So we can fix that. Let's turn off the split by going into the background, and then let's zoom in here, and then let's grab the background color. We're going to grab the color of the shadow, which is like that, and now it's matching in nicely. So I think that's kind of looking good. Again, we can come back in here and adjust anything that we need after the fact. Now that we're done with the energy effect and the shadow, let's get into doing the particles. So let's take a look at our original clip. One of the first things we're going to need to do is isolate the basketball player so that when we generate the particles, it'll only be the person. So this is where the magic mask can come in handy, because we don't need a perfect mask. So I did this magic mask earlier just to make a roto shape, and we're going to use this to drive the particles. And just to make it a little bit easier on Fusion and the processing, I rendered out a JPEG sequence. So I made a saver. By default, it gives you the option to export an EXR, but you can just change that to any format you want that Resolve understands and export it out. So I wanted something light, so I exported out JPEGs. The only thing to be aware of is that you need to have this save alpha to color turned on, because the JPEG doesn't carry an alpha. So what it did was it pushed the alpha into the color, and I'll show you the example of what I did. So I just rendered that out, and so here's the matte. Let's bring that in that I rendered out, and then let's just take a look at it real quick. And so what it did, you can see here, we have color turned on, and we have the alpha in the color, but we actually have no alpha, and that's fine, because this is gonna process really fast, and we're gonna use that to drive our matte. Okay, so let's put this in place. So the way this works is we're going to use a channel boolean. We'll take our main clip, drop it into the foreground, and take our alpha and drop it into the background. Now let's take a look through the channel boolean. Leave everything at default, and if we go down to alpha, all we want to do is grab this background alpha. Go down, click on the alpha, and go down to either red, green, or blue. We can pick any one, and that's going to bring in the alpha. And now you can see we have the alpha. We just need to multiply it. So let's add in the alpha multiply, and there you go. Now we're ready to start doing the particles. So now that we're getting ready to do the particles, instead of using the emitter, we're going to use the image emitter. And the image emitter is what it's going to do is it's going to break this image into particles, and using the color from our image will be the color of the particles. So it'll actually be a little bit easier to use, and it's going to be a pretty cool effect. So let's add in an image emitter. The other nodes we're going to need a turbulence, which we're going to use the turbulence is what's going to help drive the animation of the particles that we want. And then we'll need a renderer. And between these three nodes, we can get a pretty cool effect. The image emitter, we're going to keep that at its defaults for this. And we're going to use just the turbulence to drive the animation of the particles. One thing we want to change in the P renderer is we want to change the output mode to 2D instead of 3D. Let's talk about what we want to do here. So if we go back to our original, our comp so far, what we want to be able to do is control the emission of the particles by, as this comes on, as the energy effect comes on, we start to see his waste start to turn into particles. And as we get to the kind of the center point, which is frame 31, this is the largest part of the energy effect, we want to see him fully turned into particles and exploding kind of all around. So we need to do that animation. So one thing we can do is we can use a shape to animate through this section and use that animated shape to drive the turbulence. And so that's what we're going to do now. I have a rectangle that I've already done, and let's just take a look at this real quick. So over on the side, you can see I put a soft edge. That way it'll blend nicely but as the particles go. Down here, you can see the keyframings. Started off on frame 24, and you can see that the width and height are 0. So no turbulence will happen for this entire part of the image. And then on frame 24, we're going to start to see the particles starting to happen. Frame 25, we got the square just a little bit bigger. And then right before frame 31, which is our center point of the effect, this will be fully encompassing him. Now we can change these and we'll see how the particles all look once we get going. But for now, we're going to start with that. So to set this up, let me go back to frame 25. To set this up inside the turbulence, if we go to region, we have some options here. In region mode, we want to change that to when inside region. So inside the rectangle animation that we just made. And under region, we just want to change that to bitmap. Once I do that, you can see now I have this input in the turbulence. So now we can take our rectangle, our animated rectangle, into the turbulence, and that's going to help drive the particles. So let's take a look at what we have so far. Okay, if we come in close, you can kind of see there's something's happening, but we haven't changed any settings yet. And so let's do that so we can see what we're getting. So in the turbulence, let's go over to controls, and we have these X, Y, Z controls, and this is the turbulence for each section. And then we have our density. Now, if the density is low like this, it's going to kind of keep the mesh and particles together. But if we bring that density up, let's crank it up to like 80. You'll see a big difference. It's going to make a tighter grid, so which will mean more particles. Okay, so you can see that it's making more of a pattern. So let's crank up the strength of X and Y to 1, and then we should start seeing some real difference here. Okay, cool. Now we're getting some nice turbulence. We're starting to see the particles come apart. Why don't we put this into our composition so we can kind of see what's happening. So I'm going to take let's add a merge here, and let's take our P-render into this. And now let's look through our final comp, and that way we can kind of see what's happening. Okay, so on frame 25, we should have no particles. And so just as this point comes on, we start to see the particles. As we go through, let's see, frame 28, now you can see more particles starting to break apart. By frame 30, it should encompass him completely. You can see that starting to happen. And then by 31, there should be, you can see that he's all breaking apart. And then as we go through, past that point, you should just see an explosion of particles. So at this point, there's a lot we can do, even with this simple setup. We have a bunch of different options here. We can crank up the density more. Let's bring it up, and that should give more of a spread. We could add in more turbulence, or we can add in different forces to get this shape the way that we want. So again, the options are endless. This is just the base of the effect. Okay, so you can see that right there, just cranking up the density just made this even spread out even further. So that's looking pretty good. So the last thing we'll do for this part, I think this looks pretty good. Once we render this out, we can come back and make any adjustments that we want once we see the whole thing together. The one thing I do want to do is let's go back to our center transition frame, which is frame 31. That's the peak of our energy effect. And what I want to be able to do is I want to fade off this explosion, because I don't want this explosion, the particles, to just sit in the middle of the air. I want it to slowly fade off. So what I'm going to do is in the merge, let's click on a blend at frame 31. And I don't know, let's go to like frame 45 or so, maybe even 50. And we'll have the particles fade off. So on frame 45, let's blend this off. And that way it'll just look like the particles are dying. So I'm just going to do frame 35. Let's take a look at that. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And then frame 40. Yeah, and it's just slowly fading off. So that's going to look kind of cool. Okay, so let's say we're happy with that. Okay, great. Now that we have that done, we want to do the last thing, which is to have a cloud of particles and have it come together to recreate the person as he comes back on. So this is going to be a little bit trickier. I think what we're going to do is just reverse the shot just for the transition, run the particles, and then reverse it again to match up with our transition at the end. So the hard part is going to be figuring out the timing of this whole thing. So let's take a look at that. Okay, I'm going to open this up a little bit. We need a little bit more room here. So let's go to frame 71. Now 71 is our center point, right? So how can we figure this out? So the way we're going to approach this is frame 71 is kind of our center point. That's the largest that the energy effect is. So we're going to add 10 frames before and 10 frames after. So frames 61 to 81. And we're going to use that range to reverse. So it'll be easier for us to figure out, based on what we did on this particle system, where the keyframes should be. Okay? So we're gonna basically be able to copy this whole thing and move it over. So first thing we should do is let's set up the 20 frames, the 10 frames on either side. So we can just take this setup right here, copy, and paste. And I'm just gonna make a little router here. Let's move this stuff out of the way. And I want that connected into the foreground of the Boolean. And in this media in right here, which is our mat, let's change that, whoops, to 6181. And that's going to make it easier for us to figure out what's going on. So if I look through here, we see we have 61 to 81 done and nothing after that, right? Now I just know this from when I was playing around with this. Fusion is at some point is not going to like the fact that we're reversing this clip, running particles on it, and then reversing it back and then trying to merge it. And we're going to probably have to render off at certain points parts of the sequence. But since we're only using 20 frames, it should make it pretty easy. But let's see how far we can go, and hopefully we can get at least to the point we can get through the particles without having to render out a piece. So what we're going to want to do at this point is we want to be able to flip it. So what we're going to do is let's add in a time speed. We'll just add that in. In the time speed, let's change that to -1. And if we take a look at this, it should, we're only using frames 61 to 81. It should flip them within this range. Okay, so we should go to frame 61, should be what would be 81. So we perfectly flipped this based on that center point of our effect. Now that's important because it's going to make it easier for us to figure out where that keyframe goes. So now what we can do is let's copy our same particle system and then paste it. And then we're going to connect this in here. Now the only thing we have to do is move the keyframes for this, really for the rectangle. And we can do that with the keyframes, but we don't know exactly where we want these keyframes to begin. So let's take a look here. So we have 76, it's still on. 77, it's completely off. But so by frame 77, these should be completely back together. Frame 77 to 81 is 4 frames. So since we're going to reverse this, starting at frame 61, we'd go to 65, and that should be the start of the keyframes. So let's set that up. So I'm going to grab our rectangle. Let's open up the keyframes. And we're going to take all these keyframes and we're going to move them all. So the very first keyframe is on 65. Because remember, the first keyframe is when the rectangle is completely closed. So that should work out. I have to do a little bit of adjustment because he's in a different position. So let's move our keyframes. And so that should be pretty good. Now, one thing I didn't mention in here, and this is probably a useful thing, is inside the keyframes. Since we don't, in the P renderer, since we don't really need to process any of these other frames, we can shrink this down. So I'm going to move this to be frame 61 to 81. Or actually, yeah, 81. Because those are the only frames I'm going to use for the particles. Okay, so the particles are looking pretty good. This should work out well. And now let's try to add a time speed and see what happens. Okay, and we're going to try to reverse this. This might crash the whole thing. It might have worked. And then we should put this over the top. And then let's take a look. Yeah, this is really, 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 really slow. Okay, it seems like it's working, but it's like moving so slow. I'm going to unhook this. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a saver right here. So I'm going to add a saver. We're just going to render out these particles just to make everything move a little bit faster. So particles 61 to 81. So we just need to change this setting so that it lines up 61 to 81. And let's drop that media into our time speed. And then now we should be able to see what's going on. And let's see how well this works. So 75, 76. Yeah. So he's completely back together by then. Okay, and we want to set a little bit of fade in and fade out on these particles. So on frame 71 is the transition point. So we want definitely the blend to be on full. 61, we'll have it go down and off, so it'll fade on. All right, cool. I think let's just render this out at this point because we've done so much and we haven't really looked at the render. But all the places are, everything's in place. So from here on out, we'll just have to do tweaking. All right, great. So our render's done. Let's press play and see what we got. Okay, it looks pretty good. Let's see. We got there's definitely got a couple of problems. Right here, the shadow is off. It should be back here. So we're going to have to fix that. I mean, it looks good from here on, but the beginning of it needs to be fixed. At the end, the shadow looks good. Also, the particles are, well, there's a couple settings we can set. I'd like to dull that down. I don't really like that brightness. And we also haven't added any subpixel rendering, which adds a kind of a natural blur. So we should do that. And the last thing I think will be I think it would look nicer if there was particle shadows also on the ground. So let's do those fixes. Okay, first off, I'm going to undo the particles just temporarily so that I can focus on the shadow. And let's see, let's go back, yeah, somewhere like frame 27. Let's set let's move that shadow back into place. It's going to go like there, and then maybe something like that, right in his waist. And let's see if that does the trick. Okay, that's much better. That's what we're expecting. So that looks good. With the particles, let's go to the particles. Okay, and with those particles, I'm not crazy about that. So one of the things you could do is in the particle emitter, we have the apply mode. We can change that from add to merge. And then we also want to turn on the subpixel rendered. You can see that it looks much nicer. So I'm kind of happy with that. Yeah, I like that a lot better. And then we're going to need to do the same thing for this one. So in this emitter, let's change that to merge, subpixel rendered. And because we have this broken apart, we're going to have to render it out again. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to turn that one off temporarily. And let's set the in and out points to 61 to 81. And we'll just kick that off. Okay, 61, 81 done. Okay, press OK. Now that should load up here once we start to put it in. Let's just see if it loaded in. Yeah. Okay, great. Now let's reset our range. And the last thing we wanted to do was add some shadows, which we'll do the same setup that we had here. So let's add a background, and we're going to break our P render right into our background, and I might need a little bit of room here, kind of squishing it in, and then add a corner positioner, connect those up, so connect that up, yeah, connect those up, and then let's merge that. And remember, we want to merge it behind the particles, especially this one, because it's going to go right to his feet. And then we can just use the corner positioner to position this. I'm going to change this to bilinear, and that's a little bit easier to work with. So that might be pretty good. I'm going to put some keyframes on here. And then let's just go through and make sure that we have it line up. Now remember, at the beginning, you're going to have this, yeah, right here, you'll have these dark shadows. So something like that. Once we change the shadow of this, it's going to, it'll look fine. I can, you know, we don't have that part of the leg because of the way that we're doing this, but I think it's going to look good. So let's just double check. All right, we might have to do some adjustments on this, but let's go to the background and let's get that color a little bit closer to what we're doing. You can see that once we get it into that color, I think that any kind of discrepancy on this is going to probably be fine. Yeah, I mean, that's looking pretty good. All right, so now we need to do the other one. Oh, I have to merge on and off this. I forgot. So with the corner positioner that we have here, I forgot that we need to merge it on and off. So we can do that using, we already did that with this merge. We're going to copy the blend from merge 6. So in merge 8, go to blend, right click, connect to merge 6, blend. There we go. And that should, yeah, there we go. I was going to say, geez. Okay, right? Now we got that. So let's go to frame 71, and we're going to do the same thing here. So let's add a background, a corner positioner, from the time speed, go into the background. Sorry, this is getting a little bit messy. Should have made a lot more room. And then we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to change it to bilinear, and then let's set up this shadow. Okay. So let's take, now we're just going to set the color. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Let's look at the final one. Okay, cool. Okay, and let's just kind of step through it before we do our final render. Oops. Okay, we have, I forgot to do, okay, so for this shadow right here, we have the, we have it merging off here, but we still have it on at the beginning. So let's, I think we can turn it off for the shadow here. Let's turn it off frame 25. If we blend that down, that should take care of it. Okay, and I think we have to do the same thing to the other shadow. So at 61, it is off. 70, it's on the way, and then let's go 76. or 77, it should be off. I think that's going to be good enough. So let's render that out and see what we get. And hopefully this will be it. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely spend some more time on this. Okay, so I think that's going to do it. This one ran really long. I wasn't expecting it to run this long. So if you have any issues or if I missed anything, leave a comment. I'll try my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.